Well, hello and a very warm welcome to this, the first of three seminars hosted by Project Bohoeffer on the broad theme of Bonhoeffer's legacy for today. My name's Alan Deacon. I'm the current chair of Project Bohoeffer, and I'll be chairing this meeting, but not mercifully responsible for any of the technicalities. They are in much more capable hands. Our format this afternoon will be that we will have a presentation from Ben. John Battle will then begin the discussion as discussed, and we anticipate that there will be plenty of time for questions. If people want think of a question or a point they'd like to raise during the course of the presentations, if you'd like to put that in the chat, we then have two options. I can either invite you to unmute and raise the point, ask the question yourself, or you could indicate that you'd prefer me to ask it for you. One factor that's relevant to that is that this meeting is being recorded. Both Ben and John are very happy for it to be recorded. So if you prefer not to be recorded, then you could ask a question with your screen staying blank, or there is a facility to edit afterwards to take out any particular contribution if people wish to do that afterwards. So with that, I'd like to issue a very warm welcome and thanks to Ben, who is our first presenter. Ben is a trustee of Project Bohoeffer and has long been an active campaigner within the justice and peace movement within the Catholic Church, but he's now primarily known for his work and advocacy on behalf of asylum seekers and migrants. In 2015, he co-founded an organisation called Seeking Sanctuary, which coordinates assistance and support for people as they arrive on our shores on boats or when they're still within the camps around Calais and Dunkirk. This isn't not a universally popular cause in Dover or Deal, where Ben is a local councillor. And he has written a very powerful piece, which is on the blog section of the Project Bohoeffer website, writing about how he has drawn inspiration from the life and work of Bonhoeffer in countering the hostility and opposition that he continually meets, and essentially what helps keep him going. And it's this theme which he's going to develop in his talk to us this afternoon. So it's a very warm welcome, Ben, and over to you.
Thanks, Alan, and it's great to be here. I should have mentioned as well another connection, which is that I'm completing a master's dissertation on German Christian resistance to the Nazi regime. And it's that work that has stimulated me to sort of think through some of the issues that we'll be thinking about this afternoon. Can we go to the first slide, do you think? Thanks very much. What I want to talk a bit about today, it might be a bit controversial, I'm not sure, but we can pick that up in the chat, is where are we as activists in the justice and peace movement, in whatever connection we're involved in. In my case, it's migrants and refugees in Dover and slightly beyond. And what I would like to do is to pick up the lives of two remarkable men, Alfred Delp on the left and Bonhoeffer on the right, and reflect on the question, does this actually, and does their example provide any hope, any inspiration? Okay, so next slide. How do we energize ourselves and others in the face of a relentless, intolerant narrative? Are we at risk of internalizing the narrative which we are combating? Do we ourselves become intolerant and feel inadequate? Is there a message from the churches, and does it sustain us? And some ways forward, learning from the example of Delp and Bonhoeffer. Okay, can we go to the next slide? I think one of the things which I'd like to pick up this afternoon is the story of these two remarkable men. One, a Catholic Jesuit, the other, a pastor in the evangelical church. And they were, if you like, kind of instrumental in a lot of the opposition to the regime in different ways. But then they were imprisoned, and Bonhoeffer in 43, Delp in 44, and one of the effects of their imprisonment was that their whole attitude changed. They couldn't actually, they couldn't in fact breach active resistance. And without knowing each other very well, both turned to this issue about what might the future of humanity look like. How can we say anything about the future of humanity? Have we actually failed? Incidentally, they were both held in the same prison. We don't know if they were able to communicate. The likelihood is probably not. But they wrote some remarkable words in their, basically, in the last weeks of their life before they were executed. Delp was executed in February and Bonhoeffer in April. And just really to kind of put a bit of context here, can we put the, yeah. Can we go back one? The whole German church movement, you might say, was really quite confused. The Bekennenden Kirche, which was the movement started by Bonhoeffer during the war, was divided at regional level. These very unpleasant folk called German Christians who believed in the Hitler regime were still influential. And there was sometimes from the Catholic Church a confused and sometimes contradictory message in spite of many brave protesters. And one of the things we do know about is that Delp was in the forefront of a Jesuit community in Munich, desperately trying to get the bishops to say something in their sermons, and also instrumental in getting messages to the Vatican about the concentration camps. And both of them felt in a vacuum in leadership. Next slide. They were both involved in the Kreisau Circle, which was a think tank devoted to post-war Germany and a future united Europe. They weren't so much influenced by the whole whatever resistance was, but they were idealists looking forward. I don't say too much about Count von Moltke with his wife Raya, but a remarkable man who in fact was executed and imprisoned pretty much at the same time as Delp. What was interesting about Delp was that he specialized in Catholic social teaching, and also Jesuits were particularly loathed by the regime. He was offered his freedom if he would renounce the Jesuits, but clearly he wasn't able to. Next one. He became a Jesuit with, Delp became a Jesuit with socially progressive views, not always popular with his superiors, but nevertheless part of what we now know to be the Munich Circle of Resistors. He was, I think, as I mentioned, making constant appeal to the bishops through all sorts of means to kind of get them to say something, particularly the cardinal in Breslau, but they refused to do it. He entered into dialogue with von Moltke, one of the leading members of the Kreisau movement, but he was tortured and shackled. And the writings that we have are absolutely remarkable. They're called prison writings. They were written on scraps of paper while his hands were still shackled, smuggled out in his laundry. And what's particularly remarkable is that there's a wonderful introduction by Thomas Merton, written in 1962, which sets the whole context of our talk today. Next slide. And alongside them, I just want to mention two other very committed people. Lothar Koenig, who was his contemporary, actually had to hide for a year in a coal cellar of all places, and a very, very brave lady called Margarete Sommer. Okay, next one. So Delp as he, and we'll come on to we'll come on to Bonhoeffer in just a few minutes. Delp became profoundly depressed in his prison cell about what he may or may not have done. And he talked about the fact that mankind had become practically incapable of belief. And Merton picks this theme up again. Man must struggle to regain his spiritual freedom. He must hear that voice which cries to him in the wilderness. And what I find so remarkable about Merton is that 60 years later, these words are so prophetic, particularly in our troubled times. And Delp went one further. He talked about the people who are pious. He said, the most pious, precious prayer can become a blasphemy if he who offers it tolerates or helps the further conditions which are fatal to mankind or weaken his spiritual, moral, or religious self. And he talks about the piety of the pious. He refers to, in Latin, the expression is homines religiosi. He describes them as people who very good at prayer, but don't take that prayer forward. And are there lessons for us in the justice and peace movement in thinking about the fact that, you know, here we are in prayer, how do we take all this forward? My own experiences are that I am a member of a prayer group and have been another member of a prayer group, but to actually translate that activity of prayer into action is a challenge, certainly for me and for others. Next one. A church that makes demands in the name of a peremptory God no longer carries weight in a world of changing values. The new generation is separated from the clear conclusions of our traditional theology by a great mountain of boredom and disillusion, thrown up by a past experience. We have destroyed people's confidence in us by the way we live. Well, that was written 80 years ago. And I just think that actually those are very prophetic words. And he comes back to this theme, please beware of the homines religiosi. Next one. And in his last weeks, he talks about the fact that we are blind to spiritual things. The soul of modern man remains numb. His soul remains numb, inert and helpless. The mission of the church is to create conditions in which man can return to himself and hence to God. We must restore modern man to a state of fitness for God. We must find ways to tackle the spiritual wilderness. And when I think to some of the things that I've been involved with, and I'm involved in politics as well, and I find very interesting and slightly troubling the fact that within my own involvement in politics, I haven't yet come across any colleagues who, if you like, draw their inspiration from a spiritual life and the life of the gospel. And I find that quite a challenge. Next one. And at some future date, the honest historian will have some bitter things to say about the contribution made by churches to the creation of the mass minds of collectivism, dictatorships, and so on. Isn't that prophetic? Instead of finding our true source, we busy ourselves with relatively insignificant details of ecclesiastical bureaucracy and the niceties of law. And we don't know that much about his last days in prison, but we do know that the last week of his imprisonment before his execution, he became profoundly depressed and really wasn't able to function particularly in any way. And then something happened. He actually kind of came to the realization, which in German I'll say is Gott mit uns, Gott mit uns. He came to the realization that in spite of his kind of gloomy prognostications, God is still with us. God doesn't let us down. God brings us along in hope. And it was those final thoughts the day before he was executed that led him to feel a sense of optimism. He said to the prison chaplain in Tegel prison, he said, I'm in luck, my friend, because I'm going to meet the Lord in half an hour. You might have to wait a few more years. I thought that was a beautiful expression. Next one. Let's go to Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was living with the frustrations of resistance. He had a slightly easier life in Tegel prison. He was a little bit more able to write and wrote some remarkable things. And we see from his words from prison that he was changing. He realized that the Bekennendenkirche couldn't face the challenge of the German Christians, and life was becoming dangerous. And he particularly had a good friend, Eberhard Bettger, who he corresponded with. And he writes in a particular tome called After 10 Years, he kind of reflects his pessimism. Next one. And after 10 years, he reflects on the question, are we still of any use? Had we been of any use? And he points to this remarkable, which I think is a very interesting one that we can pick up in the chat, of a certain type of person who in German he calls Bildungsbürgertum, very difficult to translate. But really, the Bildungsbürgertum are people who, if you like, believe in all the right things, but don't take their actions forward in a kind of desperate situation. They're people who, if you like, kind of fretted over the consequences of responsible action and let the evil continue. Next slide. There's this lovely expression, the lost people of Kantian rationality, the curators of virtue, but who forsake Jesus Christ. And I ask myself sometimes, am I one of these people? Am I one of these who kind of just, believe in the right things, who don't take it forward? If somebody says to me, Ben, are we going to go on this demo? Are you going to do something? I say to them, not sure. One of the things which I've been actively doing over the last year or two is where we have things like World Day of the Refugees. I try to organize a vigil of prayer, or just a vigil at our memorial in Dover for deceased migrants. When we hear about a death in Calais, a tragic death in Calais, I go and lay flowers with, if I can, at the memorial. Twice this year, I tried to organize a vigil, basically. And with many of my friends at church, I talked about this and put it in bulletins and got all sorts of things. And would anybody like to guess how many people came to the vigil? You there? Anybody like to take a guess? No, I can't hear any responses, but the answer is one person. And I said to myself, is it still worth it? Am I still kind of worth thinking about this? And Bonhoeffer poses this really interesting dilemma, which maybe we can pick up in the chat. More of us than I realize, including me, might have elements of the Bildungsbürgertum dilemma. Next one. We have become silent witnesses of terrible deeds. We have become cunning and learnt the art of obfuscation and equivocal speech. Experience has rendered us suspicious of human beings. And too often we have failed to speak a true and open word. Unbearable conflicts have worn us down and made us cynical. are we still of any use? And again, it's a question that we can reflect on, that I know John Battle might want to help us to think through, because I know, John, you've got some views on this whole issue about, are we actually silent witnesses of terrible deeds, or are we doing all we can? And of course, with the very recent events in the Middle East, as well as the war in Ukraine, we are driven to think about some of these issues. What I find challenging is when I go to a cafe here in Deal, or when I go to Wetherspoons or whatever it might be, I overhear conversations, and I haven't yet overheard a single conversation about the tragedy of the world around us. What I have heard is about what we might do today or tomorrow, or what football match we're going to go to, or how football got on. But I think that both Delp and Bonhoeffer would want to say to us, hang on a moment, there's more important things that we need to engage with. And that's a particular issue, I think, for our young people. Next one. And skip one more. Sacrifice, courage, and much more. Nobility exists from sacrifice, courage, and a clear sense of what one owes oneself and others. By the self-evident expectation of the respect one is due, at issue all along is the rediscovery of experiences of quality that have been buried under so much rubble. All thoughts and feelings can be reduced to the basest level. And I think it took Bonhoeffer his experience in his prison cell to understand and realize the profound meaning of some of these issues. He may not have been able to think about it while he was out, while he still wasn't in prison, just as it took Delp in his suffering to kind of think through some of the consequences of his thoughts. Next one. There must be a return to the aristocrats of conscience. Nobility arises from and exists by sacrifice, courage, and a clear sense of what one owes to oneself and others. At issue all along the line is the rediscovery of experience of quality that has been buried under so much rubble. Next one. A new nobility is spirited by a fierce love of the world, to take part in Christ's greatness of heart, in the responsible action that in freedom lies hold of the hour. In the responsible action that in freedom lies hold of the hour. Next one. And we go back to the beginning. I think that what I've tried to do in this sort of fairly brief talk is to reflect on what we might call the message of these two men. We have to realize as well that they didn't operate in a vacuum. There were many others as well. I've mentioned Lothar König, there were Franz Jägerstätter, Franz Reinisch, many Protestant pastors as well. I haven't mentioned, but it's worth mentioning, that many priests and religious were locked up in Dachau concentration camp in all of this. But what I find very remarkable, and I'm hoping to write a bit more about it, is the fact that these two, who didn't know each other particularly well, they probably met in the Kaiser circle, while they were imprisoned, came up with kind of very similar reflections. I don't want to end up on a gloomy note, because I think both of them found as well at the end of their lives an inner tranquility that said to them, actually, Gott mit uns, God is still with us. For Bonhoeffer, it was the Sermon on the Mount. For Delp, it was a series of reflections and meditations he wrote about Advent. And if you read his remarkable book, Prison Writings, what we see is a reflection, a detailed reflection for every Sunday of Advent, because he believes that, if you like, in the midst of all this evil, the hope of Advent brings us peace, brings us confidence, brings us optimism for a better world. And again, what I think is remarkable is that even in spite of the fact that at the end of the war, the German churches fell out, there were brave people who realized that we have to take this whole idea of, if you like, the kind of what a social conscience looks like. We have to take this forward. And that was the beginnings of the kind of what we might call the compassionate identity. So I believe that I can only speak personally and say that looking at the actions of these two remarkable men have helped me to realize that, yeah, it is still worth it. Yes, I will not become Burgerstom, whatever that expression is, and I will kind of say to myself, I'll get those flowers and I'll lay them. I did actually say to you that in the last vigil, one person turned up, but then totally unexpectedly, a local priest turned up as well and made a blessing. And some people who hadn't hardly heard of the whole event traveled 30 miles. So that made it all worthwhile. And it's on that note, making it all worthwhile, that I think I'll stop there and invite questions and discussion. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Can we thank you very much indeed, Ben. I would now like to invite John to begin our discussion and reinforce the point I made earlier, that if you wish to make a note of comments, observations, points you'd like to raise later on, or questions you'd like to ask later on, please do so in the chat. But before then, can I invite John to begin our discussion? Like Ben, John is a long-standing, very prominent campaigner within the Catholic Justice and Peace movement. He's probably best known, certainly outside Leeds, as the Member of Parliament for Leeds West from 1987 to 2010. And between 1997 and 2001, he was Minister of State successively for Trade and Industry and then Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. Like Ben, he remains an incredibly active and effective community campaigner, whether it's defending and restoring a community baths, defending people affected by asbestos, or a whole range of other issues. He's a one-man movement, really, John Battle. And so we're extremely delighted and grateful to him for finding the time to join us now. And so I invite John to begin our discussion.
Well, thanks, Alan. Can I say, listening to Ben causes me to say, with grateful thanks to Ben, perhaps less movement and more reflection. I thought that was a superb reflection on those two people. I'm sometimes reluctant about PowerPoints, but we really do need the way that Ben has drawn out those quotations, because both those people give us very deep reflections. Bonhoeffer more in very intense volumes that are tough going. But Ben, I thought what you did was draw out some quotations. They say that, prayer is threefold. The first thing is God help me, a desperate prayer for help. Prayer as petition. The second prayer is reflection, taking a few words, meditating on them, if you like, letting them sink in, tease them around, pausing in our lives of engagement and asking the questions, how can we do things differently? And I just felt if we can take away those quotations that you chose, they are massively helpful reflecting on our troubled times now. One of the words that I came across recently, being rethought, if you like, was the word remember. To remember. Do we remember the dead and those that have suffered? But the person that had written the word remember put a little hyphen between the re and the member. And what they suggested was that rather than seeing remembering as looking backward to just honouring the lives of a dead person, to seeing memory, remembering as a future activity. How do we put that broken person or community together to build a better future? And I think we can draw that from these two people, not least the quotations that Ben had shared, and that we can hopefully take away and take time out to reflect on more. And I'm left with 3 or 4 clear areas of question in my mind. The one is the word activism. I think in culture, not least in America, which we seem to be over imitating, increasingly activism is becoming a term of abuse. Social activism, social justice is seen as a term of abuse in the American media and creeping into ours here as well. So my first question would be, is activism a virtue or a vice in our time? Is activism a virtue, or even as it was suggested recently by a minister, a crime? And the second thing would be about the church. My second question would be, and it was that phrase in Alfred Delp, an irrelevant church. We're all worried about relevancy, perhaps too much, how much immediately we're relevant, rather than a life of service that doesn't perhaps want to immediately get the accolades. How relevant are we? Perhaps we take a longer term view, but in our time, is the church as a whole and across the dominant denominations as an institution in retreat from the complexities, indeed the mess, the confusion, if you like, of our times, the contradictory messages that Ben referred to right at the beginning in that history of the church's responses in that troubled time of the 30s? Is the church as an institution in retreat from the complexity, indeed the mess of our increasingly unjust and yet violent and conflict world? And is, as it were, quietism and piety replacing the need for action? And then a question that's stimulated by Bonhoeffer, and I have 2 here. The first one was, in Bonhoeffer, there are a couple of words that come in regularly. Of course, the title of the book, The Cost of Discipleship, cost, the price. But it's underneath the umbrella of the word sacrifice. There was that lovely quotation that Ben chose. Are we prepared to sacrifice all reason, principle, conscience, freedom, and virtue in a concrete response to God? And they added, only the ones who answer the freedom call to obedient and responsible action. In other words, what are we invited to give up? What's the cost? What price do we have to pay? And it's that notion of paying the price. Can we have cost-free activism? Can we have cost-free engagement? Can we have either with society or with the church? Is it cost-free? Can it be cost-free? Or how can we reconcile the fact that we might have to pay a price to bring about justice and peace in our world? I think my favourite quotation on my wall from Bonhoeffer is a phrase that was lifted up by many of the Latin American liberation theologians, and that quotation read, "Only a suffering God can save us." Now, that is a dramatic challenge to say, can we pay the price? Is there a price to pay for our engagement? And then finally, and Ben alluded to this a little bit, the whole thing about speech and words. I was so encouraged by the notion of Alfred Delp with his hands bound together, trying to scribble out words on scraps of paper. In other words, he understood, as did Bonhoeffer, that words really matter. We pay attention to words We transform the world by paying attention to words and using words for good or evil. So we should be careful with words and language. And there was that phrase in Bonhoeffer, equivocal speech. We have learnt the art of obfuscation, and how in what we sometimes describe now as our post-truth world, where we cannot believe, we have fact checkers all over the place on the BBC and elsewhere to say, is the truth coming out, or are we totally subject to untruths? Are we silent witnesses to what's going on because we can't even describe in truth and justice with a true and open word, to use Bonhoeffer's words, what's going on? And there was that lovely phrase, unbearable conflicts have worn us down and made us cynical. I almost scribbled that down as I heard it and thought, I'm going to stick it right across the face of my television as we witness the terrible events in Israel and Palestine at the present time. That phrase that echoed through the gospel right at the end. What is truth, said Pilate. I think what we get from Ben's presentation today are words that he shared with us from two people whose challenge is more pertinent to our times than we could have imagined, but they are two people living in a different time whose words are difficult to unpack, and yes, whose words are complicated, but then we too live in a complicated world, and their witness might help us to see a way forward. And then finally from me, the question of, are we any use? I think I would say my inspiration also comes from within some of the writings of Pope Francis, and indeed the Pope before him, who was seen as quite a reactionary in some ways, but he did write a letter to the church, the Catholic Church, and it was called Spe Salvi, and that was on hope. And Pope Benedict said, we don't suffer from a crisis of faith. Don't get hung up on asking whether Dawkins was right and how do we prove that God exists. He said the real crisis is a crisis not of faith, but a crisis of hope. How do we develop hope and encourage others to have hope? The great Raymond Williams said, perhaps our task is to make hope possible and not despair inevitable. I say that in the context of what I feel, certainly in the Western world, are increasingly a politics and a political strategy of fostering fear and despair. And the great Augustine said, hope has two beautiful daughters, courage and anger. And my question would finally be, how do we express courage and anger together to generate hope? And that is a massive cultural question, but these two witnesses that Ben's introduced us to today may give us some pointers in how to actually draw a strategy together of blending courage and anger to deliver what's desperately needed, which is renewed hope.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, John. Now, as anticipated, we have ample time for questions. I don't see anything has actually arrived in the chat yet. I'm going to go onto gallery so I can hopefully see everybody. Is there anyone who would like to respond, make an observation? Perhaps Ben would like to respond to what John has just said, or if others, I mean, I know they're all clever little technical devices in which hands go up in corners, but a slightly more basic way of waving, I can see everybody would work. But I don't know, Ben, do you have any immediate responses to the questions John's raised following your talk?
They are all incredibly relevant, I think. And I think that one of the things that, as John reminds us about, is that there's something about hope. And indeed, both Delp and Bonhoeffer believed at the very, very end of their lives that, if you like, the message has to be one of hope. We do know that Delp was completely in despair in the 48 hours before he was executed, but it was actually a kind of realization of hope, and hope that God is still with us, that brought him through those 48 hours before he was executed. We know about the witness of Bonhoeffer with his fellow prisoners as well, and the fact that he conducted a prayer service full of hope on the day before he was executed. So that word hope remains an important one.
Thank you. Does anybody wish to unmute and make a comment or observation? I suppose the question that arises me is that, I mean, if I suffered from imposter syndrome, I would never do this job with Project Bohoeffer, because I know appallingly little about Bonhoeffer. Sorry, Mike, you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in now?
I wonder whether we learn from these two people and our new experience of their thinking that we need to stop thinking that our righteous actions will immediately achieve the goals that our hope points to. That we have to relax in the fact that we do what is possible in our little situation, but trust to God to make the changes, and therefore not to be too surprised when the actors that bring in those changes are not part of the church or the faith movements in any way.
Sorry, yes, Marianne.
Yes, I think to a certain extent there are questions that have arisen from the behaviour of the Catholic Church, particularly after the Second World War, during the Second World War, and immediately after. And it seems to me that some people like Bonhoeffer, who was not a Catholic, but like Bonhoeffer, Thomas Merton, Teilhard de Chardin, there were some people whom we look up to, but who were not necessarily the darlings of the church. And there was also, I think, after the Second World War, if I remember people like Eichmann, and there were many, many others, and Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. I think there were many, many Nazis, prominent Nazis, who were protected by the Catholic Church. And then I asked myself, you know, when you talk about courage and you talk about anger, more recently, I don't know what Bonhoeffer would have known or might have known, or what would his reaction have been. But it seems to me that power in the institution is really detrimental to some people, or many people actually, complaining. And I've only got to look at the sexual abuse scandal that has marred not just the Catholic Church, but certainly the Catholic Church. And ask myself, why would I trust them? And I think this is very negative, but I don't anymore. And so, and now in the UK for the moment, but not just in the UK, also in many other countries, United States, France, India, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, we have a resurgence of the extreme right. And appalling violence. I won't even go into Israel. What can we do apart from voting? And I mean, I was not British. I became British because of Brexit. only because I can't trust any of them. So I thought I wouldn't believe a word they're saying about what will happen to EU member states resorts in terms of trusting the UK government that we might be able to stay here. So I just applied for British citizenship and idiots gave it to me. So now I can vote. But I think it's the trust into institutions that's been eroded for many, many, many years, and it's only just getting even worse. So what are we to do apart from despair?
Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all those points are just so relevant. What are we to do? And I reflected on this after a vigil which I organised in June. I publicised extensively across 5 parishes with ecumenical involvement, and as I say, got the one person. Although other experiences were very different for me as well. Yeah, I think we have to somehow, as John was describing, link whatever life we have in a church or an organisation with a degree of hope and commitments. Every time I say to myself, no, actually, I won't go to London for that demo, I feel a bit like those Kantian people that I was describing earlier, that Bonhoeffer rather cynically describes, and it's a very German expression. And I say to myself, hang on a moment, at least you can do this, you can do that, or whatever, and share that witness. So there's something about an individual response, which I think is very important.
Jeff? Jeff, you're unmuted.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, sir. I think one of the most powerful things I've heard in the last hour was Pilate's question, what is truth? And put in the context of the way truth has been abused in the modern world, either for commercial material wealth or for political power or what. I get the impression that most people who have sort of absorbed that propaganda is to say to themselves, okay, we'll try it and see what happens. But their existential question, and probably mine too in my life, has always been, what is the right question? And how do you meet that question? What is it that comes out of Bonhoeffer's example and his teaching of Christian faith that inspires me to think that I'm near it by walking down their road, if you like, and face the issues that I believe are the ones that are important in our generation. And you know, that's the sort of issue that I think has come out of listening to both speakers, who I must say have told me things that I thought I knew about Bonhoeffer, but I clearly didn't. And I'm very impressed and I'm very grateful, and I do want to say thank you at this point. But that's the issue that seems to me to be underlying so much of, perhaps it's only one of the 3 or 4 points, the 3 or 4 questions that John mentioned, but it for me was very important.
Yeah.
Thanks. I wonder whether anybody wants to pick up on that and provide any answers to Jeff's very powerful questions. I'd only say before anybody wants to make a response that my sadness is the fact that these questions are not even being asked. These vital existential questions in our times, to me, are challenging. But in my friendship circle and my social circle, there's probably only 2, 3, or 4 people who, if you like, want to or think about addressing some of the questions that Jeff is raising. The rest want to get on with their lives and go to the pub and sort of make sure they've got enough money to, in these desperate times, to do things. So it saddens me that, certainly in my own circle, the conversations that I can have about these kind of terribly important issues are very limited. But I wonder what everybody else thinks.
Yes, please, Phil. Phil, you need to.
I was waiting for the thing to react to my problem.
Hello, Phil.
Good evening. I'm with Ben, co-director of an organisation called Seeking Sanctuary, which we go over to Calais and see what's going on there and try to spread the word about what the facts are regarding people who make these dreadful journeys over here. And we will often get vilified if we give interviews on local radio and TV about the genuine facts of this so-called invasion of hordes of alien people. But what I wanted to say particularly was that because of that, I got a phone call 18 months ago from the lead bishop on migrant affairs in the Catholic Church in England and Wales, Paul McAleeden, to say, oh, the nuncio wants to visit Napier Barracks to find out what's going on. Napier Barracks being the former army camp near Folkestone, where hundreds of migrants are being they're being forced to live there, shall we say. And so I had no idea about this at all. And I managed to uncover a group called Friends of Napier. So I said, who do you talk to about something like this? And she told me the appropriate person in the camp management, the contractors who work for the Home Office, who advised me what to tell her and explain what a nuncio was, and then tell the nuncio who to contact in the Home Office, and she'd be ready for when the Home Office asked her what could be done about it. And he turned up on I think it might have been the 1st or 3rd of March, almost 18 months ago, in the midst of a snowstorm. It's very unusual. And he went in and he talked to the people around there, and he said the Pope had instructed him to visit and find out how people were getting on there. And when he reported back about what he'd seen, the Pope signed a certificate of blessing, which he sent to the nuncio, who took it down to Napier, where it's on the wall in the common room that the people can share there. And that's this said nuncio has just been made a cardinal as a matter of interest. So there are signs of concern at the top level in the church, but my great sorrow is that it doesn't seem to come down to much to the parish priests and the laity.
Thank you.
Can I just respond to that and say Phil is my great companion in this kind of rather challenging work, and we speak quite often, and we kind of cheer each other up by saying, yeah, we can do this. And Phil's a great pragmatist and has done some wonderful things in getting the church involved. Yeah, it is a challenge. And I think I was mentioning earlier on that in the vigil that I organised, one person came, but in the vigil I organised 2 or 3 weeks ago, a priest appeared. who I knew from our parish and who obviously didn't immediately connect to it, but, you know, was there, present, and, you know, we just have to kind of keep on encouraging that word of witness. But thank you, Phil. It's been great working with you over all these years, and long may it continue. And let's just not get ourselves. And I hope that my presentation didn't fill you with a feeling, my God, is it all still worth it? Because I know that you think the opposite. So thank you for that, Phil.
Yes, please, Carol.
Right, okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I just wanted to say this papal nuncio went and visited this place, and that some message got back to the Pope. But what practical use is him sending a written blessing to these people? It's all to do with this question that we had about our quietism and piety replacing the need for action. Couldn't they have done something that would have been a bit more practical benefit to people in dire situations?
I'll respond to that and say, I know John wants to have a word in a minute, but there were, I think, some practical benefits. One of the things that we found out about the residents of the Napier Barracks is that their lives were just kind of too, so, you know, the conditions of the place made their lives too, just too difficult. So we decided we fundraise, but we fundraised for a party. And actually, that was one of the best things we ever did, because it gave people a sense of new hope. We brought in caterers. I think it must have been around about the time of last Christmas or so, but I think it was the most positive gesture that our donors gave. But anyway, John wants to have a word, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah, a couple of things. One is, I think my response is, and it is about this quietism issue, and why do we carry on battering against dysfunctional organizations? And I have to confess to being still deeply addicted to doing that within both the Catholic Church and a political organization. And you can get a flattened head by trying to change and resist it. But why do I mention it? I think I am not a utopian anarchist in the way that I would imagine I could change the whole world overnight and live in a different one. There was a wonderful word by a Russian anarchist who said, another moral victory and we're all dead. So I think we've got to carry on. And what we've to try and do is to challenge the institutions, to transform the institutions. And the only way to do that is to engage with the institutions. And one of the things that in 1992, the Catholic bishops published a very encouraging document in a way on the general election that year. And the title was about engagement. And they had 3 sections. One was welfare action, you know, encouraging people in the church, the Catholic Church and elsewhere, to be involved in welfare action. Think food banks and visiting elderly people and the sick and those detailed actions that a lot of people do on the ground that's unmentioned and not taken account of. Then the work of empowerment and encouraging communities to develop themselves and take lives into their own hands in a way and build the future from the bottom up. So at one end, you've got welfare action, and at the other end of the spectrum, that empowerment. But in the middle was this word advocacy. This word advocacy sometimes is degenerated into the word lobbying, and we know where that can end up in America and the corruption of, if you like, professional lobbying. But if we took the word advocacy, and interestingly, it's linked to the advocate and the paraclete, but I haven't the theology quite to take it that far there. But that notion, what is advocacy? The weak part of that 1992 document was advocacy. And I think that's the weak part of the church at every level. How do they speak for the voiceless and make sure that the voice of the marginalized is heard, represented in the challenge to the institutions, both church and state, as it were? And I think that's really the challenge. And it's not an easy option. Near me is, just to close with this, is an abbey called Kirkstall Abbey. And the monks lived there as in the same tradition as Thomas Merton. They were Trappist monks that lived in silent prayer and reflection, reciting the Psalms 7 times a day for 400 years, as well on the side building up a sheep farm, of course. But when the abbot of Kirkstall Abbey in the 13th century was asked what prayers were about, and particularly what was contemplation, he said this, he says, petitionary prayer is when we ask for God's help in a crisis. Meditation is when we reflect on some words of either a scripture or a saying or a phrase. And then they said, but contemplation, that's a really hard word. What do you do when you contemplate? Because officially you're Trappist contemplative monks. And Abbot Ralph in the 13th century said, contemplation is developing the capacity to take a long, loving look at reality and implying not run away from it. And it's that ability to take a look at reality. If you look from Kirkstall Abbey to the southwest, you'll see the maelstrom that is called Armley Prison, where we dump people that we can't cope with in society by and large. But I think the challenge is we can't escape from reality. It's a hard world is reality, but how do we keep together in conversations like this to encourage each other, to challenge the institutions, to actually do something about those hard realities? And I think at the end, my response would be, we don't have any option, but to actually engage with institutions that we know are dysfunctional, that will do our heads in, will wear us out, but together we have to keep working on to force them to change.
Can I just spend a minute or two quoting from Thomas Merton, because I think he's got some answers here. Delp's prison meditations are a penetrating diagnosis of a devastated, gutless, faithless society in which man is rapidly losing his humanity because he has become practically incapable of belief. Man's only hope in this wilderness, which he has become, is to respond to its inner need for truth with a struggle to retain his spiritual freedom. Any others?
Brett or Liz Bitola, yes, please.
Yes, I do want to speak. I've listened with awe and interest and hope to everything that's been said today. My learning comes from poetry mainly, and there is a beautiful poem by, I think it's W.B. Yeats, about what's happening in our world today, although he isn't still alive. But one line is, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And in that one sentence, I think he's described how I at least feel about the world today. One of our speakers asked, what is the cost of sacrifice? And I'm left with the question, in the midst of all this, what am I prepared to give up? What am I prepared to do? Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you. Yes, William Gibson. Yes, sorry.
Hi. Just a couple of thoughts, I suppose, on the question of hope and just what John was saying there about facing reality in the way that things are. I think a lot of the times the discussions around hope, especially in church and Christian circles, can sometimes appear as if it's about optimism. And I think it's really important that we challenge that. I know that a good friend of mine who's a Palestinian liberation theologian, she was at Greenbelt this year and she was delivering a talk and she was asked the question, what are you hopeful about? And her honest response at the time was, "I don't know if I can say that I am." And afterwards, she spoke about how oftentimes her own viewpoint is reduced down to being the Palestinian voice and representing that particular viewpoint alone. And it's the same, I think, with young people a lot of the time. It's like, oh, we'll bring the one young person along who can speak for young people. But the question of hope, I think, relates to Bonhoeffer's concepts of like costly grace and cheap grace. And I think similarly, it's necessary to talk about cheap hope and costly hope, that cheap hope is that points us just towards optimism, whereas costly hope forces us to face reality, essentially. And in facing that reality, we have to enter and acknowledge the pain, because when you take up your cross and when you go on that road of discipleship, really, if you're looking at the Gospels, if you're looking at the story of Jesus in that moment of the crucifixion, there is no hope at that point. We only have hope now that we have seen the resurrection afterwards, but acknowledging that at certain points it can feel that way. And I think that's where what John was saying about hope that has courage and anger in it is so important. But in my experience anyway, a lot of the discussion around hope doesn't really grapple with that in the church, that there's not often a space for especially young people to express anger at certain issues. It was Henri Nouwen that spoke about the idea of nuclear man, that we live at a time where there's these threats that mean that not only are we concerned about hoping for the near future, but the potential like ongoing existence of the human race, either through nuclear war, but especially now with climate change. And that these can be really difficult to face. So I suppose the question would be something along the lines of, how do we foster that hope that is a costly hope that faces reality? And then the only other thing that I really wanted to raise was what you were saying about advocacy. I think advocacy is less speaking up for the marginalized and those who are oppressed and those who are the least of these, and it's more empowering them to speak. I've recently been working on a piece about the theological ethic of solidarity, and Pope Francis talks about it at points too, and it requires this engagement with the people who are actually oppressed and hearing what they need for us to be able to stand with them rather than for them. So it's necessary for standing alongside, which I think is a lot, again, of Bonhoeffer's concept of community is what you see there, but a lot of kind of different threads to tie together. But yeah, the main question being, how do we foster that costly hope that recognizes the really bleak reality of things at points, especially for young people in the face of the climate crisis and global violence and war, and encourage that through courage and anger.
Thank you.
Can I come back on that? I mean, I think those points are so important, and I think both Delp and Bonhoeffer were really quite prophetic in their words. One of the things I could have mentioned a bit more, which I didn't, was the power of ecumenism and the power of working together. And you know, when we look at the very last weeks of Delp's life, he was able to celebrate the Eucharist with wine that was smuggled in. But even more interestingly, the people in the next cells, one of whom was Count von Moltke, and the other was also a well-known person. Count von Moltke was in fact a member of the evangelical church. He wrote to his wife and said, "You'd be horrified by the fact that I'm actually, taking part in a Eucharist." But this is the way forward. This is the way that humanity has got to move on. They didn't actually take part. They knocked on the prison wall with their chains and went from there, basically. Thank you. I'll be back in a minute.
I wonder if I could slightly go off at a slightly different tangent and raise something that I've been puzzling with. I think it was John quoted one of Bonhoeffer, that only a suffering God can save us. And one of the things that I've always never really I suppose understood is not the right word, but I can see that, in a sense, the difference between Bonhoeffer and the people in the German church was essentially integrity. They both professed the same things. One of them carried it through, the others didn't. But when you talk about only a suffering God can save us, gods that save us are gods that intervene. Whereas I've always understood, in a sense, the suffering God was a way of, in a sense, trying to reconcile the notion of a loving God with what existed in the world. And I had the impression that towards the end of his life, Bonhoeffer was embracing more the suffering God, the God who is there with us through the agonies, which is not the same thing as a God that can intervene and change it. That's probably a bit garbled, but this is a non-theologian talking at this end. John's smiling. I've clearly made some wonderful, great howler, but do you want to come back, John?
I think your challenge is spot on, and that is the question, isn't it? And that is where then, you know, those that someone said to me just the other day, I'm not a religious person, but I've seen so much on the television that's so terrible in the recent days. I turn the television off and pray, because you can't do anything else. And that really stopped me in my tracks, really, because when we were thinking about the quietism, the phrases that Ben reminded us of in what was it, the homines religiosi, that what we do is pious prayers are the only answer, and that that notion that nothing can be done kind of haunts me in a way, and I kind of my instincts scream against that for some reason. But at the same time, listen, I didn't catch the name of the person that spoke just before me, actually, but I thought that they were really wise words about solidarity, being with people. Compassion means to suffer with people. And I just think compassion is not just kind of feeling for somebody and I feel sorry for them, but how do we actually go through the process? And I think what it says to me, that phrase, it's more about the nature of a God, the mystery of a God, than it is about the harsh reality. In other words, that the mystery of the God is God is, how should I put this? We can't understand God in a way. The mystery is permanent, but it is a God that understands human suffering to such an extent that is willing to enter into the deepest experience of that human suffering, represented in the crucifixion. And I think in a strange way, that is a very hopeful thing. And that connects to the wonderful way that Ben expressed both Delp's and Bonhoeffer's last moments. I think they are really important to reflect on. And I sometimes think that, I think it was Mike said it as well in his contribution, you know, we can't hope to solve all the world's problems or even imagine that we're making a major contribution to them, but we can do our little bit. But the question then is that in the history of the world, to have faith that we're going in the right direction together, and that there is a meaning and a purpose to human beings, and every single person counts. And I think that matters, and that comes through in those, if you like, in the attitude to death that's expressed in Delp and in Bonhoeffer. And if you were to ask me what I think one of the greatest tragedies in a way, is our inability in our culture, and I experience this in the voluntary work I do now in a community centre in inner city Leeds and the work I do with groups there. It's our inability to deal with death. We don't even mention death, we say people pass, which is interesting really. Pass where to, I often try and ask myself, if not them. But this notion that we can't really deal with death in our society, because we've lost a sense of the meaning of it. And I thought that what Ben introduced us to was a way of saying that, yes, a suffering God can save us, because the suffering God suggests in the mystery of God is an answer to the question of, can we get beyond death?
Yeah, John, that I think I entirely agree with you. And this whole issue about the fact that we're not allowed to say somebody died, but they passed away. And as you say, passed away where to? And as I mentioned earlier, Delp was profoundly depressed in those. In fact, he was kind of quite cheerful until those last few days, but then drew comfort from this sort of Gott mit uns, the fact that the suffering God is still with us, still present, still there, and is still the hope for the future.
I think Haddon wanted to. Haddon Wilmer. Yeah.
Yes. I am a bit troubled by a lot of things. One is that coming back to this question of only the suffering God can help. Bonhoeffer, I think, all through his life, actually knew that he was very weak, and he was in a movement that was very weak, and he had to live through this history. And at the end, he was quoting for his own encouragement, really, Jeremiah 45, which is the words of comfort that God gives to Baruch, who was Jeremiah's young secretary, as the exile was coming and the whole of Judah was going to be swept away, and Baruch was going to lose his job and his status. And God comes and comforts him and says, don't seek great things for yourself. If I'm unmaking the world, what are you to complain about? And that is a dreadful thought. But the point is that certainly Bonhoeffer, who had a profound awareness of the whole history of Europe that they were living through, right from the 20s and the 30s onwards and getting worse and worse, he was aware in those last days, I think, increasingly, that they were in the unmaking of the world in all sorts of dreadful ways. And I think that the tone of our conversation has troubled me, because it seems to me to be so immediately concerned with what do we do now, and then expecting the bishops or the popes to come and do something, as though they ever do. And we haven't reckoned so profoundly with the possibility that we also, in our way, are living through the unmaking of the world. And God's going along with the unmaking of the world. It's a great reversal. And the point is that Bonhoeffer met that with a profoundly Christian faith that rested on God who comes and actually shares this suffering, but God who demands obedience and faithfulness in the midst of the unmaking. Now this Bonhoeffer's whole work adds a dimension, I think, to the both to the spirituality and to the politics that has come up in our discussion. And I'm sorry if that sounds very critical, but I think it's a bit much to ask people to expect. I can't do it, but to measure up both to what Bonhoeffer was thinking through all his work and the history that he was living through. And the last thing I'll say is that I think it's very important for us not to isolate Bonhoeffer or Delp or any of them from their whole history, and not only to confine them to the history that led down to 1945 and left them as martyr heroes who gave their lives in a futile struggle to alter the course of history. I think we've got to read it and ask what happened afterwards. And some good things happened afterwards.
some good things were done. What was done after 1945 was not all a continuation of dreadful things. And we need to, I think, if we're concerned with our situation, actually to reflect upon the significance of the rebuilding, the very imperfect rebuilding, but the very genuine rebuilding of human society in Europe after 1945.
Can I come in on that? Just to say that's so helpful, and I entirely agree with you. And when we think of the movement towards understanding and mutual understanding, and people like and people like Heinemann and one or two others, that legacy, if you like, was and unfortunately now maybe the unmaking of the world is a kind of another issue, but that legacy was particularly important. And we might say that both Delp and Bonhoeffer could have been comforted by some of the things, the good things, and the United Nations and all sorts of other things that happened after the war. So thank you for that.
Just going back to gallery so that I can see if anybody wants. It is now just gone 10 to 4. I'm wondering if anyone has any more any concluding thoughts. Anyone who hasn't joined in the discussion so far. If not, I might ask John and then Ben just to see if they have any more concluding thoughts. Is there anybody else would like to raise anything? Yes, please do. Sorry, I can't see him. Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you. Well, my name is EJ. I'm a Church of England priest, and I actually work for the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I can't even remember how I came across the invitation to this talk, but I just wanted to say thank you for all the contributions, because I think many years ago I did a master's, and my master's dissertation focused on German resistance to National Socialism. And I've just found the whole conversation and all the different perspectives has been immensely encouraging. And it's also encouraged me to go back and do some more study. And I think that whole question, are we of any use? I think that we are. I think this is how God works, by bringing people together and just listening. I just feel really encouraged and energized, and because I think going through all the things that we do in the Church of England, sometimes it can be utterly depressing. And you look at the Church of England as an institution, or I do sometimes, and I think, oh, I should get another job. And just coming here and hearing all these stories and just reflecting on Bonhoeffer and Delp, I have just found everything to be really inspirational. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for your encouragement and for all the learning as well.
Thank you very much for that. The reason it probably crossed your desk is that we had a conference on Christian responses to migration in February, where we had a wonderful paper from Bishop Rose, Bishop Hudson Wilkins, who's obviously, you're all in the same office, and so I sent details of this to her and Richard Brady, I think it is, who was facilitated that. But anyway, I'm so glad you could make it, and I hope you're able to come to the other two seminars as well. Thank you very much for that. Ben, John, do you have any quick thoughts? It is now.
Yeah.
Well, only as we finish to say thank you very much for that last contribution. And one of the most inspirational figures I have met and known is Bishop Rose. When we invited her to come down to our memorial plaque to remember the 50 Chinese who died 20 years ago, she came without hesitation and made a moving speech. And it just shows that kind of witness does and can encourage, and I certainly have been encouraged by all of that. So thank you very much for that last contribution.
Do you have a final comment, John?
Yeah, just to say, echo the word of thanks, particularly Phil Curtin, to see Phil again and all the work he does, and also Haddon's comments, really challenging, and a sincere thank you. when I listened and thought at the end of Haddon's comments, I was reminded of, or I just remembered the great theologian Herbert McCabe, who was holding a seminar, and he asked at the end, has anybody got any thoughts? And one of the students said, what I feel is, and Herbert McCabe pounced on him and said, I don't want to know what you feel, I want to know that you think and listen and learn. And I'd have to say, what an afternoon of listening and learning. And I just hope that we can share what's been said by the questioners as well as the contributors, as it were, in some form, so we could go back over it, whether as a podcast or in the new fashioned way of social media, so we can listen again and learn a bit more, because I personally found it's been a very challenging and fruitful afternoon. So thank you for organising it.
Thank you very much, John. Well, can I thank you and Ben for your contributions, and everyone for coming, and just to issue again a warm invitation to the 2 following seminars. This time next week, Reverend Dr. Keith Clements and Dr. Stephen Plant will be discussing, in a sense, the challenges to ecumenism arising from the war in Ukraine and the stance of the Russian Orthodox Church. And in 2 weeks' time, another of our trustees, Ellie, will be discussing Bonhoeffer's later writings on unconscious Christianity and religionist Christianity, and the discussant will be Rowan Williams. And so, as I say, that is in 2 weeks' time. But unless anyone has any final, I think I'll just thank everyone for coming. Thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you, and hopefully see you all next week. Thank you.